Well, hello. I'm just checking that this is working with those that are in the. Yeah, we have feed. Is that the saying? We have stream. We have summing. We have a signal. Good afternoon. It's Monday. It's the 21st of October. Come on, Bennett. My name's James. Thank you for being here. We're going to do a session today all about interleaving. I made it into some kind of bread treatment, all to do with interleaving. Okay, it's quite an interesting session, this, because in many ways I want to sort of introduce and develop the idea of interleaving with you, but I also want to demystify it and simplify it for you. So that's kind of in the mix of what we're trying to do within this particular session. Now, we are going to lean a little bit on a session we did a fortnight ago on practice and retrieval. I'm going to make references to that. And that session is available. It's online. If you haven't seen it, you can see it. And just be aware we're going to be making references to that. I've got Marta with me, who I'll point the microphone at, who's over here. I could turn my camera around and show you Marta, but I don't want to pull any cables out. She's over there. Marta's going to do the chat for us this afternoon. And Marta, initially, can you do me a favour? Could you make sure that everybody in the session has got access to the infographic, please?
Yes, I can. Can you also make me a panelist?
Oh, you want to be a panelist? That would be beneficial.
Yes, thank you.
Let me go to participants, attendees. Marta, you've got to be in here somewhere. There you are. I'm going to promote you to be a panelist, Marta. There you go. So you're now a panelist, hopefully. There you go. Okay, so Marta, if you could put that into the chat, that would be really great. So if in the chat, guys, you have a look at the infographic that Marta's going to share. First things first, the infographic is a record of everything I'm going to talk about within the session. Secondly, you're going to see me work directly on the infographic within this. I'm basically going to make a right mess of it and scribble all over it and draw things and what have you, and it will get messy, but that's the record that we want you, as it were, to have your takeaway, your kind of your giveaway, as it were. So that's an important one. On the giveaway, just make sure as well you stay to the end, because we are going to give you a voucher at the end of today's session, and you have to be here to receive it. So we anticipate today's session is going to be in the region of 35 to 40 minutes, there or thereabouts. It definitely won't go over 45. Secondly, if we have any technical problems, so for example, if our Wi-Fi was to go down here, just stay on this link and we will be back up. It's very rare that would happen, but if it does, we'll be back up as soon as we can be, but just come back to the same link and sooner or later we will reappear and what have you. So that's great. Marta's there for the chat. Put your questions in there. Anything else that we need to clarify will be done that way. So with that in mind, I'm going to have a go at sharing my screen, and specifically, if I can find it, specifically my sketchbook. Bear with me a second, which has not appeared for me. Brilliant start. So let me see if I can share my sketchbook with you. Bear with me a second, guys. Marta, could you confirm with me what you can see on the screen, please?
I can see the layer editor.
Is that all you can see?
Sketchbook, yes.
Okay, well, that's not what I wanted to share. So let me try again. So I may have to share my entire desktop if I don't see any alternative. Just bear with me a second, guys. I'm trying to find my sketchbook. So it's looking like a whole desktop. So let me go with my desktop. Now, I'm hoping, Marta, that you can now see.
I can.
Now, that was not what was meant to happen. Never mind. Hopefully it will work fine. Now, I'm going to minimize a little view of myself. Now, what we've got here is we've got some information which hopefully via the infographic we've just shared, you already have access to. Okay, now, I first of all want to take the concept of interleaving and I want to give it its quintessential notion. We have a definition here. This is the best way, I think, to think about it conceptually. We want to define, first of all, what happens now in most cases. So if we consider that now, in most cases, in most classrooms, what we get is a situation where students study one thing at a time. Okay, so if we assume that that is the default typical way, now of course there can be many exceptions to this, that students currently study one thing at a time, we would call this block learning. Okay, now what interleaving is a proposed alternative to this process, and I'll tell you the structure and the benefits of why that might be relevant, because what we are just finishing prepping for the That wasn't meant to happen. That was interesting. Anyway, let's just go back to the canvas. Good little interruption. It was
really
actually me. There you go. Brilliant. Now, live stuff. I knew there's a reason why I didn't like it. Now, what we're suggesting with interleaving, so if I just call this IL for a second, interleaving, what we are suggesting here, and I want to be very simplistic to begin with, is the idea that, that students might study a few things at a time. And that, in a nutshell, is all we are talking about, okay? Now, a couple of additional things I'd just say about this interleaving structure. We are suggesting here that it's the idea of mixing different topics and or skills together, okay? Mixing different topics and or skills together. But before we get kind of super concerned about this and think, well, I've therefore got to kind of just obliterate my whole teaching plan here. This can be as subtle and grab as you go as you want. This does not need to be that we take something like a teaching plan, a yearly structure, a course structure, something like a scheme of work, and we break it up and sort of slip it, we sort of subdivide it and put it in a completely different order. Nobody is advocating that to my knowledge, and if they are, they shouldn't be. Now, that leads us, I got my sketchbook. Hey, there you go. That's what was meant to happen. So that leads us beautifully to this definition. Interleaving is learning and practicing, and the key word I want to draw out here, related topics simultaneously. That is all we are talking about. Now, we've got some proposed benefits here. I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail in a moment, but more importantly, let me draw you down to here, because I think in some ways this is the quintessential view of what we want you to grasp and develop with regard to interleaving. This here is our now structure. It's what is probably happening in a majority, perhaps not yours, but in a majority of classrooms, okay? So the suggestion is this. Let's take anus. I meant A-N-E-S-S, anus. I can't not giggle. It just came out. I can't not find it funny. Right. Let's take the concept of A as being one single kind of lesson topic. Okay. What we tend to find in current classrooms is that we might teach A, then students do some questions and some worksheets on A, and then perhaps they do something like a past paper question or a practice question on A. They then might repeat that the following lesson for B. Okay, so for B-ness, that's absolutely fine. And then again, that would repeat for C-ness and so on. So I would say that is to some degree predictable with regards to what is happening in a lot of classrooms. It may be more or less familiar to you. It's hard for me to know that. Now, what interleaving is suggesting is that we take A, we take B, and we take C, different topics, different ideas, different concepts, and we learn them together. So they're learned together. And perhaps here, they are practiced. They are practiced together. And in a nutshell, that is all interleaving is. Okay, so let's imagine that this here is the teaching of one concept, and this here is the teaching of another concept. Interleaving is suggesting that we can teach those things simultaneously for a better understanding from the learner, okay? Now, it's really important to stress, I'll just stop sharing a second. It's really important to stress that this cannot be done with any range of topics by things that are abstractly linked together, or they're linked by abstraction. That is not what we are advocating here. We need, whether it's in terms of a delivery or a teaching episode or a practice or review episode that's being interleaved, we need concepts which are either similar or contrasting. Another great way of thinking about it is if there are topic areas that students tend to confuse with one another, they're great things to teach in an interleave structure. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. Now, I'm not actually going to teach it because who wants to watch a Wally like me teaching, in this case, biology? But I'm going to just flash up on the screen to you. That's going to appear on top here. 2 types of cells. It doesn't matter if you're a biology or a history or a PE or a RS teacher. It's not important what the content is here. What I want to stress to you is that what we have over here is we maybe have concept A. This is a sperm cell. It is a gamete. I mean, its proportional size to this plant cell we'll look at in a second is actually gigantic. This is a terrifying sperm cell. Nevertheless, very, very typically, in fact, I would say close to 100% of the time, it is taught in complete isolation to this topic here, which is B. This over here is what we call a root hair cell. It's found in the roots of plants underground, basically. Now, I would predict that these things are taught together almost never. Okay, a classic biologist sort of lesson would be specialized animal cells would include sperm cells, and then perhaps next lesson, specialized plant cells would include plant cells. What we are suggesting with interleaving is that A and B could be taught together. Now, why would you do that? Why would you consider that? I'll come to the research and the theory of that in a second. But the first thing to say is that they have similar characteristics, at least some. These little things here are mitochondria. So are these here. Okay, they have similarities. Secondly, this one here has a nucleus containing half of the genetic information of that organism. Okay, whereas this one has a nucleus here containing 100% of the genetic information of that plant in this case. We also have similarities in the sense that some of the structural and functional idea of these cells will be similar, others will be different. In other words, they can be taught together, and the similarities of them and the differences of them become meaningful to the learner. Now, if we just reflect on what we talked about with practice and retrieval a fortnight ago now, we know that better learning is more meaningful learning. Am I advocating always teach sperm cells and root hair cells together? No. The point is you could, and there could be benefits to that. Okay. Now, equally, you could teach them completely in blocks and simply practice them together. That also brings the interleaving advantage, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, before we sort of jump out of this mode, what I do want to do here is I want to think about what can be interleaved. So I think this is a really crucial question. What should we even be considering when it comes to interleaving? So there's a couple of things I want to stress. I want to focus on different topics for a moment. We should be considering similar concepts. Okay, concepts which are related. Guys, please don't, I'll come back on the screen for this rather odd statement, please don't teach the abortion debate in religious studies and the history of football from PE together. They have no relationship to one another. It would be ludicrous, okay? But as we showed before, we might teach cellular biology in a way where certain similarities and difference allow an alignment of learning, okay? That might be possible. Next point, we're looking at similar concepts. Next point, we're saying, and I've just made this point already really, avoid abstraction. Please don't try and force an interleaved topic together with another one. There's no point, it won't work. So don't use abstraction. In most cases, we have discussed within our office of the odd occasion where that actually might be quite intriguing, but it's quite rare. And thirdly, we would encourage you also to avoid what we call multitasking. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're looking at teaching 3 things simultaneously. We're not suggesting that you would just hand over to the student 3 times as much work and tell them to get on with it. Okay, that would simply be a challenge of multitasking and putting them in different orders. Okay, that is a different thing to what we're talking about interleaving. Now, there are certain advantages to this. So I just want to look at pluses to this similar topics. This is really exciting. Students appear to understand context better. Okay, so our students may get a better understanding of context. Now, I think that should make sense to us. We are encouraging our students to make ongoing comparative analytical reference to other learning in relation to that which is being learned for the first time. That is helpful. Secondly, and I'll come back to the reason for this in a second, it's argued that this will create stronger neural connections. Now, I'll come to the reason for this in a moment, but I'll just leave that hanging for the time being. And the other positive is that we get increased performance in terms of retrieval. Okay, so what gets remembered appears to be greater. This middle concept, I think, is really exciting. We can interleave old and new learning. That is interesting. Okay, now we could focus here on reactivation. The idea that once something is learned, that Thalheimer concept, that it must be reactivated over time to prevent that forgetting, that Ebbinghaus forgetting curve to take place. Okay, so we get reactivation, we get decreased forgetting. And if we get decreased forgetting, we can be confident that we will get better learning or better remembering in the future. We also get what's called the spacing advantage. Okay? And what that means is the student is ultimately exposed to the same material over a longer cycle of time. So consider, for example, when students are practicing that which they've just learned, consider mixing it with those things which have been learned previously. And finally, with what can be interleaved, consider interleaving both blocks and leaves. Okay, so as an example of this, in fact, I've got it all the way down here. Let me just drag this all the way down here. We've got this idea that you might just simply teach in exactly the same blocked structure. So think about your delivery being identical, or one's delivery being identical to what it is now. But when we come to the practice environment, here we've got a worksheet, here we've got an online checkpoint. Where we come to the practice, these things are interleaved. Okay, now this is a really, really important point, because it leads in the practice environment. When we interleave practice, it leads to something called, sorry, that's the wrong term. It leads to something called discriminative, have I spelled that right? Discriminative contrast, the paranoia of doing things live. Okay, now let's have a think about that for a second. When we practice things interleaved with other material, it means that we cannot accurately predict what the next task, challenge, question is going to be. Now that leads to what we would describe loosely as good question analysis skill. Now, I think that's really interesting for us, especially if we have content heavy courses, because if students are having in their practice environments, they're having to discriminate between different topics in order to accurately analyze questions. That is much closer to an idea of what they're going to do when they come to do their actual formal assessments. In other words, you know, when they go into an exam, they don't know what the topic for question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is going to be in most cases. And therefore their practice environment should to some degree mirror that experience when that is achievable. That's what we might refer to as a near transfer type notion. What perhaps we might tend to see in the classroom is, let's learn topic 1, do question on topic 1. Well, the only thing the student's going to get asked on is topic 1. In lesson 5, let's learn lesson 5. Let's do a question on lesson 5. Well, the only thing that question can be legitimately on is from that content. Whereas if the student knows that the question could be mixed from any of these topics, and they have to keep that learning alive, also they have to be able to analyze the question with more analytical skill to ensure that they are accurately answering. That is more realistic, and that is a better transfer of skill to ultimately the way they're going to be assessed towards the end. I didn't mean to speak for that long there, Marta. Questions or observations while I have a sip of water?
Sorry. No, we haven't got any questions at the moment. Everyone seems happy so far, but just a little reminder, if you do have any questions, if you have any comments or observations, please do send them this way. You can do it through the chat on the right-hand side or through the questions and answers section at the bottom of your screen.
Remarkable that nobody's got any comments or questions to make on the concept of A.
Yeah.
That's okay. Well, interesting. Now, what I want to do, guys, is let me just budge this out of the way. I've just got to lean over a little bit here. What I do want to do here is I just want to show one simple example of how we might set a task for students that sort of incorporates this notion of interleave practice. So I'm coming here. I'm going to show you something on the Everlearner. Of course, this could be entirely an analog experience too. But what I'm going to do here as a teacher is I'm going to set my student a task. And I'm imagining a scenario where I want my students to practice something, okay? And I'll just select with questions. I'll just select my group and I'll select my course. I'm going to do some biology. I'm going to select my lessons. Now, let's assume that, let's say the student has just completed a lesson, and that lesson is on plant cell specialization. But I think it's really, really important that they have an experience of practicing questions which relate to that from previous lessons. Now, I'm going to miss out animal cell specialization, despite my example earlier. I want them to be reminded about the generic structure of animal and plant cells and about the classification of eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So don't worry if you're not sure what these things are from that previous lesson there. So I want to challenge them on this new learning, and I want to remind them of this old learning. In a more advanced structure, it could be that I'm choosing things from much further down the course structure, from an interleaving with those things that have been taught way further back. But I'll keep it to a simple structure like this one. So I'll select those things. I'm going to say here, I don't know, I want my students to score 75%, and I'm going to ask for 12 questions. Okay, so they're going to do 12 questions. I'll set the assignment for now, and I'll end it, who knows, I'll end it on Friday at whatever, 9 o'clock. So here, I'm just going to put this 12 question quiz. And here, for my students, I'm going to say to them, right, you have 12 questions. You must score 75%, repeat until you achieve it. I mean, this is more of a mastery concept, but sorry, that meant to be 75%. Bit of a mastery concept there. And I might link in here. I might say plant cell specialization. I might say animal and plant cells. It's always good to be able to spell, isn't it? And I might say that they're doing this also on, what did I say? I had this on eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Okay, so they know what's coming up. So I might just make that a little bullet, a little list there. Okay, now what I'm going to say, I'm going to allow my students to retake it, and I'm going to make it mandatory. I could make it for just some students, but in this case, I'm going to assign it to everybody. Okay, so my students have now been set this task. And the important thing is that it's testing them from these three areas, that which we've just learned and those things that have been learned previously. Now, if I just jump out of being the teacher, and don't worry about this bit, it's just the ugly back end of our website. If I jump into be Draco, for example, if I go to be Draco, go to assignments, Draco has got this 12 question quiz now, which he's got as a task. So if he goes into this, there's his instructions. He hasn't done it yet, as we know. Now, the point I would say here, he doesn't know what topic is going to come up out of those three topics, okay? So he's going to go, right, I think it's that one. He answers the question. He moves on. Now, he's actually got two questions here from the same topic, but sooner or later, he's going to get something, okay? I'm just going to jump through a little bit. He's going to get something which is new to that study, okay? So he's going to go through here, and all of this material is interleaved together, okay? So I'm going to put vessel in here. That's from the new learning, okay? God's a companion cell and so on. So the point is that those tasks are interleaved from topic to topic, and he's practicing them in combination. So if you think about it from the perspective of the student, they have to think, right, okay, well, I've been set this new learning. I've also been asked to confirm that I still remember and understand that previous learning. In other words, the student here is having that previous and new learning interleave through practice. Now, no reason why it has to be an online quiz. It could, of course, be a worksheet, a series of questions, whatever it happens to be. But the impact on the student would appear to be quite positive. And I'm going to go through that in a second. Any questions on that, Marta, before I go through impact of this?
No questions whatsoever. Everyone is happy.
Okay, so I want to draw people's attention to this article here, Marta. Could you post it in the chat? This is the Meta Learners. This is the Meta Learner study. There's really 3 reports or studies that I'd encourage you to have a look at. I'll ask Martin to post them all. There's one by the Chartered College of Teaching. There's another one written by Jonathan Firth, which relates to interleaving the STEM classroom. And we've got one by a really interesting website called the Meta Learners, bit of an odd name, but it's a superb website. And there's an interesting article here on interleaving. And what I want to do from this particular article is I actually want to read something to you, which while, you know, I realise is a bit strange having someone read and dictate to you on these things, I think it's worth just going over. So this is based on a 2012 study by Doug Rohr in the University of South Florida, okay? So I'll just read it out. The study involved teaching the students slope and graph problems, and these were 7th grade students, so relatively young students. And it was done with quite large numbers, 9 class in total. So they're doing slope and graph problems. While the lectures remained almost identical, the worksheets that were handed out were different. 5 classes received worksheets based on interleaving for slope problems and based on block practice for graph problems. So 5 of the 9 groups, they got, for the slope problems, they got interleave challenges, okay? For the graph problems, that was blocked. So it was traditional, let's say. The other 4 classes received the opposite combination. The interleave worksheets contained problems of different types mixed together, while the blocked ones had problems of the same type. So the thing we need to just reflect on here before we look at the outcome is that the teaching, the delivery was identical in whichever structure it was done, whether it was lectured, whether it was blocked, whether it was, we're not interested in that. The point is that that was identical for both groups, okay? There's not entirely a control and experimental group because they're kind of both controlled, both experimental, but with different material. Now, this is where it gets interesting. 5 days after the last lesson, all the students went through a review session. Then a surprise test was given 1 day or 1 month later. The results from the next day showed a 25% better performance for the problems trained with interleaving. So that could be within the same individual, they performed on average 25% better with those things they practiced through interleaving compared to practice in blocks. The results from the next month, though, showed an amazing 76% advantage for the problems trained with interleaving versus the ones trained with blocked practice. So that becomes a real stunning finding, because if we are saying that 30 days later, when Ebbinghaus session we did 2 weeks ago, when Ebbinghaus is suggesting to us that something like 80% of all the learning could have dissipated, could be lost. Well, what this is suggesting is that through interleave practice alone, there is a significant tendency for the student to remember more and be able to reproduce more in that same time frame, 1 month or 30 days later. Now, I think that's exciting because it's suggesting to us that interleaving is more efficient, is more productive than blocked practice. Now, we don't know with regard to interleave delivery from that particular article. Now, I also want to draw your attention to this one from Chartered College of Teaching. And it's actually quite a broad article, this, very data heavy. But the main point in this article, and I would encourage you to read it if Martin can share it with you. The main point in this article is that interleaving appears to be one of the most impacting things you can do in a classroom that's cheap. Okay, so I'm doing a massive summary here, but in terms of something that doesn't cost a lot, like an extra teacher, additional support staff, all those things are great, obviously, but they cost. This doesn't cost anything. Okay, to interleave something doesn't necessarily cost anything. And the point from this article, or this piece of research from the Chartered College of Teaching, suggests that interleaving is one of the most effective things you can do for free or for low cost. That's quite exciting. Now, I'll also just draw your attention to the Jonathan Firth study. I wasn't a big fan of this one, so I'll really encourage you to read it for yourselves. But the main premise of this article states that what your students will experience when you interleave things with them is their first experience is it will be harder for them. Interleaving throws up what's referred to as desirable difficulty. And that is that the brain actually has to work harder to engage with the material because it has to contrast between similar ideas, whether in teaching or whether in the delivery of it or whether in the practice of it. But all of these articles clearly show that that desirable difficulty leads to much better spaced retrieval over time. Okay, that means that over a cycle of time, the student is better able to reproduce that learning which has previously been done because it's been interleaved either through the delivery of it, the practice of it, or the review of it. Now, I think that's really, really interesting because on that basis, we should be expecting when we introduce a little notion of interleaving with our students, perhaps we do teach a couple of things side by side for the first time ever. We should expect our students to go, oh, you know, this is tough, this is challenging. Yes, that is exactly what we should expect. But we should also expect, assuming it's been done with good quality, obviously, we should expect that a week later and 30 days later, the students should be able to retain more and have a better tendency to analyze questions that they're going to be asked on this and actually potentially on anything. So I think that's really interesting. Well, so I've got one more thing I need to go over. Do you want to pause me before I do that?
No, just Wendy Reynolds, she's just saying that what you're explaining is a no-brainer, so great to know. And also Emma Scott was asking if the links to articles, if they will be available after the recording, if they will be emailed. So we'll make sure
no problem.
we email all of those.
And I can't take, none of these are mine. I can't take credit for these. You know, you can see what I've done. Now, my method is a fairly simple one. I'm sure you guys will do something similar. I've printed them and got the old highlighter out. But it is good to do this little bit of background. I mean, the reading I've got here is probably 15 minutes, something like that. It's not too substantial, but it does appear to be pretty reliable. And importantly, it is consistent. I think the importance, I mean, the Chartered College one is dull. I'll be honest with you. It's not a particularly exciting read, but it gets you to the nitty gritty of why this is happening. Okay, so I think that's well worth a look as well. But yeah, we can share that, absolutely no problem at all. And Wendy, of course, we know well. You know Wendy. Wendy's been. I was at our office here at Pure Offices. Remember? Mm-hmm. Yes. Seems ages ago now. Yes. Yeah, Wendy's up in Ascot, if I remember correctly. Now then, let me go back to Sketchbook just for 1 second. So last sort of thing from me, guys. Okay. Now, this in many ways is a reminder. This is Thalheimer's reactivation curve, okay? So Thalheimer, amongst other things, showed two notions that I think are really relevant to this conversation. The first one is the difference between spaced and normal forgetting. So I just want to be sort of crystal clear as much as I can be. This might be the typical experience of learning something through a blocked classroom experience. You know, we go to a classroom, we learn it relatively quickly. This is us perhaps here leaving the lesson. And what Thalheimer is showing us is that the forgetting is quite steep from that environment. Okay, so if we learn it fast, basically we forget it quite fast. That's referred to as normal forgetting. Okay, so we learn it in blocks, we learn it in one go, we're going to forget it reasonably quickly. Now, of course, there's other variables that influence that: the quality of the teaching, how much practice has been done, the meaningfulness of the message, all that sort of stuff has an impact. So of course, the better teaching is going to lead to less forgetting, of course. But what's interesting here is that Thalheimer also showed that slower or spaced learning, this is learning over a longer period of time, okay? What we find there is that leads to spaced forgetting. And the key point is here that the rate of forgetting is slower and it is less profound, in the sense that less is forgotten. Less is forgotten, or you could make an argument that it's forgotten more slowly. Now, if we just take spacing in its own right, spacing just means that we are exposed to things for longer and we learn it, you know, over a longer period of time. If we take a single piece of learning, we can't simply say, well, let's double the length of time we spend on it, because then we get through half of a course. That's not realistic. But what this could be is that this is the introduction of two ideas or let's call them 2 topics in an interleave structure, which causes a spaced experience, and then the spaced forgetting, the less profound forgetting might occur. I'd also like to remind you that, if you've done our previous session, of the main premise of Thalheimer's work. Thalheimer said that if we here, let me just drag it down slightly. If we, after learning, if we undergo repeated review, practice, or reteaching episodes, then the quality of the learning can remain at an optimal level. But that can only be done through reactivation. So in my opinion, that is a clear advocacy for practicing previous learning that's been done days, weeks, months before, interleaved with new things that students have just been exposed to, exactly as we showed before. So I think that's a really interesting piece of evidence to say, right, okay, reactivation, we can't simply just keep learning a larger mountain of things after we've originally learned it, because we're learning more and more. But what we can do is we can strategically force students to go back and back and back and back to re-engage with things that have been learned before, to prevent that forgetting from taking place. And that's why something like a smart system of setting assignments, which allows an interleaving of practice, is a good idea. Again, can be done with worksheets, can be done with manual marking, can be done with exam paper questions that you know used to be back in there. You literally copy and paste and stick in and photocopy together. But I think in 2019 it's quite a good idea to have some smart systems that take a lot of the legwork on that. So I think they're the key messages from me, Marta. Anything from you'd like me to clarify, or anything you'd like me to go over?
No, I think it's all very clear, and it just makes sense, doesn't it? Of course, the more you keep going to things, the more you will remember things. The more you learn things in comparison, in the position, in relation to other things, the more sense they will make as well. So yeah, just.
Well, I'll give an example. I mean, Wendy, I know as a PE teacher, for example. So a classic thing to teach is something like A-level P would be 3 energy systems. We tend to teach them separately. We teach a lactic acid lesson, a glycolytic lesson, we teach a aerobic lesson, and they're sort of segmented into 3 chunks. We teach and practice this one, we teach and practice this one, we teach and practice this one. Of course, the similarities and differences between them are really quite significant. So I think what interleaving is suggesting is that you could actually introduce them together and learn the components, the structures, the functions of those things together. Now, would it slow the original process of learning all the information in one go? Yeah, and that's where that spacing perhaps comes in, but you're not learning any more. And remember that desirable difficulty point. When your students report to you, Miss, Sir, this is hard, our response to that should be, good. That is what's deepening those neural connections. Keep going. I'm here to support you. And that is what's going to lead to what we might refer to as better spaced retrieval over time, because the learning itself is better embedded. Otherwise, what happens is the brain can cheat us and go, right, okay, I'm doing the aerobic system today. My teacher's teaching me the aerobic system. The worksheet's definitely on the aerobic system because that's what the lesson's on. The past paper question is definitely on the aerobic system. As long as I know what's on the aerobic system mark scheme, I don't really have to think about this very much. Okay, so in our interleave model, we've got a structure where the student has to go through that discriminative process of what I'm being asked about, what the problem or the challenge or the worksheet or the question happens to be, what the exam question is actually asking me to do. So that's going to lead to those increased capacities to do things like comparing, evaluating, discriminating, I mean in the most positive sense possible. Those sorts of behaviors are going to be, and skills are going to become far more fluid and potent in the student, I would argue. So I think those are really important messages.
I think you've sold it to Wendy.
Really?
Saying I'm off to put it into my lessons. So, yeah.
Well, I've got to be honest with you. I mean, I don't see this as any kind of sales job of interleaving, and like, I think it's just interesting. I think one of the things to reflect on in teaching is that, and no one can really do anything about this overnight, right? But like Wendy, in your case, like your theory teaching or mine, or if probably anyone that's in this session, we're all teaching classrooms. And if we think about it, like the vast majority of our teaching goes unwitnessed by a sort of a knowledgeable adult who could feed back on that experience. Also, a whole bunch of our time, which could be used for learning and growing our sort of professional characteristics, let's call it our teacher tool belt and knowledge, the skills that we have, it's quite, the quality of that can be quite mixed. So I think what these sessions are about are simply to highlight in an easy to access format, things which could be relevant to a teacher who's spending the vast majority of their teaching time on their own, not getting that feedback and input perhaps as readily as it could be in a slightly different structure. So that's the way I see it. I mean, if I reflect on my own career with teaching, interleaving in the delivery was, I'm going to be honest with you, is not something I've done a lot of. But what is interesting to me is I find it almost impossible to block teach. So if I was to grab a whiteboard pen or, my digital pen here and was to teach you about something which I felt really passionate about in my subject, the chances of me being isolate like this element of the spec and only teach that, I'd find it almost impossible, because it by nature it draws comparisons and contradictions to other aspects of those things that we're learning. So look, in my subject, the classic thing to do is learn the location of the bones. Okay, that would be a classic thing to do. And maybe a week or 2 weeks later, we might then teach the students, well, here's the functions of the bones and the skeleton, or the different types of bones. Like when you teach, when I teach the position of bones, I mean, what's the point unless you're developing the function of why that structure is the way that it is? So I think interleaving is that thing which passionate, good teachers do by bringing the threads of their subject together and demonstrating and displaying that to the students. What I think we're arguing here is, can you use it strategically and can you build it into practice? I think that's what's really exciting. And I mean, if I put my cards on the table, I can't really imagine an environment now where a majority of the practice that students do wouldn't be interleaved, okay? Because it's so clearly beneficial that it's hard to imagine, going back to probably what I did for the majority of my career, which was here's lesson 1's practice, here's lesson 2's practice, here's lesson 3's practice. I mean, that is something that I think is hard to, I think given the weight of what we just looked at, it's hard to justify that as a single approach. Of course, it will happen some of the time. Anyway, that was a rant. Call it a monologue. Right. I make it 4:41, Marta. Is there anything we need to add into the chat, such as a voucher?
Exactly. Well, I was going to say, first of all, we need to mention if anyone would likes what they've seen of the Everlearner and would like to have a go, then we're offering free online demos. So
good stuff.
It might be better if you say, just because I don't know how well people can hear me.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, basically, guys. I mean, the upshot of it. Let's be blunt. We own this website here. This is a student logged into this website, and students, if I don't know, let's choose a PE course here. Students can come to the website here and they can study their learning. So, for example, this student is going to learn about horizontal forces here. They can go into the lesson and they can be taught. Hopefully, you can hear this. They can study all about horizontal forces here. In this case, this is me teaching this. Meanwhile, the website is tracking the milliseconds that the student is completing of this tutorial to make up, in this individual's case, 6% of the overall tutorial. They can also make online notes that bookmark against the tutorial as well. When they go back to the course, they can go into their lesson, and importantly, they can go and do practice questions called building stakes on vertical forces. Okay, so here the student is answering things that relate to this particular notion. Okay, and I won't bore you too much with this, but they can also do what's called test mode. And test mode is where the students engage with questions under time restricted and closed book conditions. Okay, so we do that. All of it's tracked, all of it's reported to a dashboard. And importantly for you as the teacher, you can set them assignments that make them do the things that you want to do. And I guess the important thing to say about that is that we have 9 subjects on that website. We have biology, chemistry, physics, PE, history, computing, English literature, Spanish, French. What have I forgotten?
history.
There's the history, yeah.
I don't know.
And yeah, so it's a really robust offer that we would encourage you to have a look at. If you want to interleave and you want to do it like that, I mean, it's like a dream. So, and also the stuff we did in practice and retrieval. Now, obviously, look, you guys are smart. You don't need me to hide the reason we do these sessions for free. It's kind of fun. I quite like showing off. But the other thing is that, of course, we're trying to communicate with you that we have that website. So I guess a way of putting that is, come and have a look at it with us. Free demos and stuff are free. We're nice people. We're not going to pressure you. But come and have a look and see what you think.
And we've got the free voucher as well.
Yeah, it's about
the £75 voucher.
The voucher's in there. So I will wish you guys a brilliant evening. Marta, what do we have on tonight? Marta and I, by the way, are business partners. We're also we're also home partners as well. What we got on tonight, Marta?
I don't know. Possibly a chat with a friend.
Chat with a friend. There you go. Chat with a friend. That sounds ominous. I'm going to spend my entire evening as horizontal as possible because it's my only evening at home the entire week. So I am going to have a big rest tonight. And yeah, we wish you the best, guys. We'll follow up with emails. We'll send recordings round as well. We genuinely appreciate you being here. We genuinely appreciate you giving up the time. We know you're busy. You're good people for doing that, and I hope it's valuable to you. We wish you the best. Have a good one, guys.